Okay, so this is the women's event for the James Connolly Festival, and we're going to be discussing capitalism, patriarchy and violence. I'm Ciara from the Communist Party, and this is my comrade Laura and my comrade Lorian. So, given the nature of this event, it's a roundtable discussion, so it's not going to have a structured presentation, but we're going to give a bit of a brief outline about what we hope to cover. So firstly, to avoid any ambiguity, we're going to discuss the form that our Marxist feminism takes and highlight some of the differences between the more prevalent forms of liberal, bourgeois, Western feminism. And then following on from there, we're probably going to discuss some of the contradictions within contemporary feminism. So as they engage in kind of campaigns for equal rights without bringing in the super exploitative system of capitalism. And we'll also be discussing the political social system of patriarchy and how that perpetuates harmful gender roles and a culture of violence, which we would consider to be inherently necessary within a capitalist economic order, that benefits not just from the division of people along class lines, but along gender lines, race, sexual orientation, ability, just to name a few. So I think we'll kick off with a really interesting quote from Clara Zetkin, which is over 100 years ago at this stage. So the quote is, "The end goal of her struggle is not free competition with men, but bringing about the political rule of the proletariat. Hand in hand with the men of her own class, the proletarian woman fights against capitalist society. To be sure, she also concurs with the demands of the bourgeois women's movement, but she regards the realisation of these demands only as a means to an end, so that she can get into the battle along with the working men equally armed." So I suppose we should probably just start off by discussing, I suppose how our feminism kind of lends itself to what Zetkin was saying in that quote.
With the quote that's been used, I think it is kind of like a conversation we were having sort of upstairs and that around the likes of repeal being one of these like campaigns of where obviously really super important, really, really necessary, but ultimately wasn't kind of like challenging capitalism in kind of the way that like I suppose other campaigning groups or whatever would be, but at the same time this was like one of the first experiences for an awful lot of young women anyway to kind of like get out and get active on like an issue that affected them. So I mean like these are things that you can like ask too much from these campaigns or whatever in some ways at the same time too, but ultimately it's important. But
so in a way it was a political campaign as such, but there wasn't necessarily a huge political awareness or class consciousness within the movement as such. They weren't bringing the reform or the change in legislation. It wasn't coming back to really changing material conditions for women, which, like it's okay to engage in struggles for reforms, but we also need to be looking at the overall system with, that these changes are taking place within.
But I think at the same time as well, when you're looking at like the likes of, because I don't want to bring these criticisms in regards to the repeal campaign, because I think that can be it was quite contentious in the way that people were saying like, oh, we lost the call for like free, safe and legal, which would have been more like one of ARC's big demand, and that kind of has to be sacrificed, and you do that because you need to make it like more palatable in order to get that majority vote. So you have to lose maybe more of the like revolutionary aspects of it, but also there was a huge internationalist element with it. It brought a huge number of young people or whatever into it as well at the same time. But if you're going to look at like a perfect example, I suppose, of like, I'm setting up a straw man to fight, I suppose, in some ways too. But the likes of, say, like Beyonce's, the Beyonce feminism, which again is something we've discussed, but it is something that comes up a huge amount. Like, I mean, she's this figure of empowerment in some ways. Like, she used her sexuality in whatever way, but she also has like it all in some senses, because like she's got kids and like a husband who supports her and all this kind of stuff, and is able to like challenge things in certain ways. And again, she's a black woman, so she is suffering from oppression in other forms. She's also incredibly wealthy, and is sustaining that wealth off the back of other women, particularly with a clothing line, which is something that's kind of like gets kind of thrown around, I suppose, a lot when talking
That'd
about.
be a huge issue within liberal feminism from our perspective, really. It's sort of a corporate type feminism, a feminism of more of a ruling class. So it's not, you know, it's kind of predicated on an exploitation of women, other women elsewhere, whether it's migrant women or, you know, women in the global south.
Usually non-white women. Right?
Usually, yeah. So, I mean, it's this Sheryl Sandberg feminism of lean in, which actually is leaning on, you know, the domestic workers, women, you know, that are already super exploited as it is.
Like liberal feminism sets up the dynamic that there are some women who are worthy of being saved from the worst excesses of the capitalist system, and you can only do that under a capitalist system by continuing to exploit others. And in these cases it is women off the back of women, also a multitude of like working class men or whatever the case is as well. So like it's liberal feminism refuses to acknowledge the class dynamic or whatever the case is, and like sets up the idea that if you have women within these power structures that are essentially dominating, it can allow for women to dream in the same way that a man is, that one day I could possibly be at the top of the pecking order, and hence we must support women in these or heading into these positions of authority, whatever the case is, without ever looking at like the damage that the system they're attempting to gain for their own benefit. But it's the same, like Zetkin was saying, like going out, you support for
reforms that will benefit women, but they're not transforming really the structure within how they exist.
The fight for women to vote, and that was centred around women of property. And then you had working class women, and of course then you had the level of racism or whatever that was involved in that as well, the differentiation in between. So like,
and at the end of the day, for working class women, being exploited by a man or being exploited by a woman doesn't change. The exploitation is still there, it's still pressed. It doesn't change.
And that's the problem with the whole notion of, you know, just looking for equal rights, because you're essentially, if you are a working class woman, you're just going to have the equal right to be exploited under capitalism.
yes.
So for us, I suppose, really, you know, we have to consider the interests of women as a sex, and then also as workers, as part of our class. So, and they're an integrated, you know, struggle there, but there's nuance that you know often gets kind of overlooked. So there's this myth that, you know, once socialism is realised, that this whole woman question will be answered. But, you know, for us then we wouldn't agree with that. So, but we do consider, you know, feminist struggle and class struggle as mutually reinforcing, I suppose, would be the best way to put it.
Capitalism can't survive without the continued exploitation of a multitude of people, obviously, but women being a large component or whatever of that.
Yeah, so I mean, if you win rights in or more rights in one part of the world, capital will just find a way to outsource the oppression onto somebody else, and usually women in the global south, as we see, you know, in these export processing zones and all these things, as manufacturing is shifted around the world, and
that's why an anti-capitalist stance has to go in hand with an anti-imperialist stance.
Yeah, absolutely. You can't have one without the other, really. You know. So I suppose for us, if you fall into, you know, you can see how liberal feminism kind of falls into the trap of, you know, just seeking reforms without looking at the actual system as a whole. And like, if you're just going to seek reforms within the capitalist system, it's not changing material conditions for the majority of women. Yes, it might improve conditions for a certain amount of women who already probably come from quite privileged positions as it is. So, you know, that would be what I would consider the biggest failure of liberal feminism, that it doesn't take an anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist stance.
Liberal feminism, there isn't a requirement to be anti-capitalist, because essentially capitalism has co-opted liberal feminism to such a huge degree. Like even the likes of International Working Women's Day, now known for most people as International Women's Day, and you can have every company, I'm not going to name any in particular, but say particular companies that might have, say, women CEOs, or they might organise an event for all of the women in managerial positions or that kind of thing, or even perhaps maybe all the women in the workforce, and talk a lot about like, oh, we're super supportive of like, you know, women in general, and perhaps even look how we send certain amounts of cash over to, you know, these other countries in the world that, you know, and
where we're supporting women, but you're not really.
An awful lot of these setups, so first off, charity in general, an awful lot of it is done for like tax reasons or whatever the case is, and is also quite exploitative in the sense that like you're not necessarily allowing for the people of that area to lift themselves up. It's the whole idea of help coming in from the outside. So all of that is deeply problematic in the first place anyway. But even like ignoring that, there can be this huge celebration kind of like centered around how these companies are doing such good work for women, but then at the same time you will be having a dinner service that's being provided by women who are on minimum wage, and there's never any kind of like concept of like how to allow for this celebration to take place. That they're only able to do that off the back of women whose work is not being sort of recognised or whatever. But even the whole idea that you would have someone who would have to stay late for one of these because it's not, it would be seen as very bad form if you didn't, and possibly a way that you would get punished in the workforce, and then trying to like attempt to organise childcare and things like that around it instead of actually kind of like it being more than that. It's something that it fits.
But there's almost a gateway that there are obstacles there that prevent you from benefiting from any of the wins of feminism or feminist movements, I think, and you know.
But you can completely understand how people kind of like get pulled into it or whatever at the same time as well, because particularly if you're a young woman coming up in a capitalist system and the first form of exploitation that you, or the first form of like discrimination or whatever that you might see or experience is going to be one that's based on the fact that people perceive you as woman. Right? And this is going to be the thing that you see is the problem, because how can it not be the thing that's the problem when it's the thing that like is most pointed or whatever the case is. And it's not that like, no, there's a lack of development or whatever with these women. It's just a case of this looks like it could be a problem that's solved. Now obviously if you are, you know, decide to deep dive and do a lot of reading material or whatever the case is, one would assume that you would get pulled to the left, and an awful lot of women do, and there's issues there with how they feel their voice isn't heard or whatever the case is. But for a vast number of women, it's going to seem like, this is something that can be fixed within this system, because we have seen people succeed within this system without actually kind of like, I don't know.
And liberal feminism make you believe that you just have to be smart enough, or marry well, or be pretty, or smile, and everything, and that you'll succeed that way. You'll play in the boys game. If you do all of that, then you can do that from within, from the inside of the system. You don't
because
need to
it places responsibility on you.
Yeah,
as
exactly.
An individual.
Exactly.
So if you
Rather
do nothing to fix it. It's
how unfair.
Yeah.
No,
well,
this
is the whole thing about equal rights, isn't it? It's like, well, you know, we're saying that in law you have the equal right. You can't be discriminated against because you're a woman. So if you don't actually achieve this incredible whatever it is, wealth or position in your job, it's a reflection on you as an individual.
Yeah.
Not that, you know, okay, Hillary Clinton can run for president, but and go to like Ivy League schools and all this stuff, but she doesn't come from a working class family. She's already advantaged compared to other women. So it's not equal rights, really, if you look at the opportunities that people have, because it's not a level playing field. But by kind of sanitizing International Working Women's Day and kind of couching everything in terms of, you know, if you just try harder, lean in, speak up, take up space, that you will somehow, you know, get that top job, which just isn't, like, you're being sold something that isn't attainable.
It's
just
almost
because
like you can't solve a systemic societal problem with individual action.
But liberal feminism almost acts as its own oppressive system, because it doesn't challenge patriarchy, it doesn't challenge capitalism. So in itself, you know, it actually, by removing the more revolutionary elements of what you know, Marxist feminism would have that you know, you're left with this very appealing type of activism, or you know, something that's not threatening to any of the systems that are actually creating the oppression in the first place. So it's almost an acceptable, you know, an acceptable movement for change.
It's nice and safe in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
It wouldn't exist in this form. It's like the whole idea that liberal feminism is something that's been co-opted or whatever within capitalism, so it can keep women fighting essentially for the scraps and the crumbs, and we can see our enemies as being those of other genders or whatever the case may be, because we can see our oppression or whatever happening within the system, and that suits capitalism just fine. And then we can turn around every now and again and we can make like certain demands, but obviously they're always very reasonable demands because we wouldn't be pushing it too far. These rewards or whatever can be given to us. We can all give ourselves a pat on the back and isn't it great, and then we can wander off. And repeal in some ways worked that way, in the sense of like women have been left behind. Now this is not to say that there aren't a huge number of activists who are very active in repeal who haven't continued to do work in that, but for the vast majority of people that dialogue has ended because it was something they did, maybe they handed out leaflets, maybe they, you know, and again, first time
It's
ever
single issue activism that
but
doesn't.
we've won, you know what I mean? And we used the system, and we won, and it was all fair game and fair play, and isn't it great? And we all pat each other on the back, but then like forgets about kind of the responsibility of like reaching everyone with that, or whatever the case is. And it's like, again, I'm not trying to like badmouth it or whatever the case is, and I'm not trying to diminish the work that has been carried on by people afterwards, but it's not something that anybody wants to read about in the newspaper or whatever anymore. Like it's not
no, as far as they're concerned, the concession has been made.
Yeah, and
the women are appeased, and now we can move on.
Yeah,
but this is what creates a problem or whatever as well, is because like, oh well, how can you talk about there being a problem with sexism or whatever in Ireland, or misogyny or patriarchy? We're not like those countries over there. We have abortion now. Didn't you get that? And you won it by popular vote. And
it's like now we have equality.
Yeah.
Like, why are you talking about like your feminism? Like, now you have equality. Like, what are you complaining about? Like, excuse me.
Yeah. But I suppose when we forget, or maybe we're just, not that we forget, maybe we don't even realise that, you know, when we talk about patriarchy, we understand that everything that happens exists within that. And, you know, it's not just men, it's women too. We're all reinforcing this system through the gender roles that we kind of learn as we grow up. And even as progressive as we might want to be, we push back against this system. You know, you can't actually, patriarchy, like you can't decouple it from capitalism. You know, it's like we say, our feminism has to be anti-capitalist, has to be anti-imperialist, and you can't dismantle a system that is kind of reinforced within another system. Like
this is where we're getting on to social reproduction.
Yes. Yeah.
No,
so
but
social reproduction is.
Yeah. But no, but like the system is continuously upholding itself, and every one of us who are members of that or have grown up within this society and these cultures and things like that, no matter how much we find elements of it distasteful or problematic or we want to fix them or whatever the case is, we still reproduce, maybe not particular things that we've picked out, we still reproduce it unconsciously all the time, and that's done through the act of like raising children, entering into relationships, the friendships, everything that we do is perpetuating it in some ways or another. I suppose it's more obvious when you're talking about the likes of children and raising them up. And again, it's also something that's completely undervalued under a capitalist system in the first place anyway. But you are what allows a system to replicate itself when you indoctrinate your youth.
Yeah.
Whether you do that intentionally or not, it's something that you can't really escape in any way.
No.
Like if you're raising like little girls to dream to be like princesses, like when I was a kid I wanted to be a princess, but that means like my life goal would be to marry to a prince and stay at home and cook and take care of him. That would be like free work, and that was just from the very beginning of my life, that was like my goal. And
Didn't
that's what
realise.
we teach. That's what.
How close are you to achieving that goal?
Excuse me, I am a princess. I don't know what you're talking
It's
about.
ironic, Larianne, as a French person, that it turns out that you're also a monarchist.
Wonderful. Yeah,
I
but
don't cook, but like.
I think maybe we should discuss a bit more, because social reproduction is probably not like a term necessarily that's too well known, and what takes place within social reproduction or what it encapsulates. And obviously within our own circles within the communist movement, it's something that we would discuss regularly.
Do you have a definition?
We don't have a definition of social reproduction, but it is the work necessary to reproduce labour, really. Isn't that kind of what Marx said?
Yeah, fair enough,
Everything that goes in. So when we talk about social reproduction, we're talking about all the work that goes on. That's not your job, your paid employment. This is all the work that goes on outside of that. So, as people are probably aware, I would doubt anybody would disagree if I said that that's very gendered work normally, domestic and care work, and it falls predominantly on women. And it's work that benefits capital, but capital does not pay anything for. So it is free labour that is not valued under a capitalist system.
Well, it couldn't possibly be valued under a capitalist system, because if it was, then you'd be getting paid for it. And by the fact that it's not getting paid, therefore it's not of value. So therefore, it's not important. We don't need to acknowledge it. It's a perfect system. They've got it all sewn up.
Yeah.
But it's also work that if it doesn't happen, people get sick, people die, people go without being fed.
People can't
even
go back to
emotional
work.
care
Yeah,
is-
everything. So
Yeah,
what
yeah.
it takes for you to be able to go home, to have your meal, to have your home clean, safe to stay in and be rested and go back to work, to sell your labour. But all of that stuff doesn't matter. It happens outside of the workplace and therefore is not work. How do you feel about that?
Personally, I think it's great.
Yeah, what you often hear referred to as the double shift for women. All that work that we do after we have returned home from our low-paid, precarious, highly exploitative employments.
We then go home to be chained to our sinks and
cook,
do the dishes and
Yeah.
feed the kids and everything else that goes with it. Like.
Yeah.
And all of that leaves women very little time to like organize, join union and stuff. So that's very convenient for capitalism to begin with.
Oh,
because
absolutely.
Then we can't fight back. We don't have
So
time.
they can no longer legislatively keep women, separated from these things, but they've left you with so little time that.
Oh, but it's worked out very well. You've allowed women into the workplace to originally become like a competitive force with men, so they could be disciplined in regards to, well, sure, we can get a woman in to do that, or whatever the case is. You've created a system where at this point now you can't really afford to have kids or a family or a life of any description really, unless you have two incomes in the home. And previously, guy would have had to been earning enough if he was looking to get married or whatever the case is, to be able to support a wife. And I'm not saying that that's an ideal setup by any stretch of the imagination, but at least you had one job in that scenario.
But it's just, that's talking about the economic situation and how actually it is no longer possible for the vast majority of people to exist or to just live with one wage, and should a person want to stay home if they wanted to.
Yeah.
It's hard enough to live with two wages to begin with. Just two income, it's already not enough in a lot of families.
Like, I don't want to make it sound like what I've said, that like this is some idealized form or whatever the case is, because obviously in these situations women were essentially unable to, once you got married, to continue working. You were not able to independently hold property. It was like your safety net was to get married, and you were, essentially proving your worth or whatever as a woman by doing this, and then continuing to keep your husband happy or whatever the case is. So all of this has always been centered around placating men and kind of serving men, and it's great because we're these wonderful accessories, and they feed us every now and again, by which I mean they give us money to buy the food, because it's not like they would bother cooking it themselves. You know what I mean? And all of that has sort of stayed to a large degree as well. because you're going out and you're working, whether you're in a long-term relationship or a marriage or whatever the case is, and whether there are kids or whatever involved. If you're in a heterosexual relationship with a man, there's still very much that requirement of like being able to be that woman who is sort of like tidying stuff up or whatever the case is, and then the stronger likelihood is, like all these different studies and stats show it, so once you do get married or you end up living together in a long-term relationship, that like the level of housework or engagement that men have with kind of any of the elements of social reproduction like drop drastically, because it's almost they've almost been trained for it much the same way I suppose that we've been trained for it, to sort of like see the job that needs to be done and doing the job and not asking questions about it.
And that kind of goes back to the whole idea, the gender roles that you kind of learn as you grow up. So they're passed down, you know, through your family, which when
even
you think about it.
You see mom cooking dinner every day for dad, even though mom has a job, and didn't she do it because she loved him and she loved us, and isn't this a great showing of love? And men talk about then their mothers who did all of this great sacrifice on their behalf.
What they did,
and women go, sure, my mom was a hero, why wouldn't I aspire?
But that's it.
Yes.
We mentioned this earlier when we were discussing earlier on this afternoon, the kind of valorization of you know, these heroic efforts that women went to keep their families going and together and all of this stuff. And it's kind of looked back in this real nostalgic way. Oh God, she was a saint, you know, everything that she did for us, and she never asked for anything for herself. Instead of taking a moment and saying, oh my God, my mother had to struggle so much. There was nothing in society, no safety net there. There was nothing there to help her. And she had to, you know, struggle every single day of her life just to get us through. Like, to me, that's just, it's a black and white argument, really. It's just like, why would you say, isn't it great that she did that? But not be like, but why did she have to do that? That's not right.
Yeah.
You know, that's not how people's lives are meant to be. They're not meant to be a struggle to put food on the table or, you know, look after all the kids. Yeah, we kind of lionize sacrifice like as if, you know, well, I mean, it's expected, but she didn't have to do it, but she did. So it's wonderful.
Sacrificial mother role.
Yeah.
But it's the ultimate.
But then daughters in that family are learning that.
Yeah.
And then they will repeat that behavior.
Yeah. And sons learn that's the way women should be, and that's what they should look for in a wife later. So.
But so you also will get men maybe coming from that background and think, well, my wife should be doing that. Yeah. This is what my mother did for her family. It's
not even a case of like, this is what a woman should be doing. It's a case of like, because it's not something that's even sort of like as intentionally as enforced as that. It's sort of this creation of a situation where like a woman's love is expected to be displayed in caring for you, be that in whatever capacity that is. Is it just like making sure you've got laundry? Is it making, you know, packing your lunch every day? And you're kind of like, you're a grown man, you can do it yourself. But these kind of like these acts of service of love or whatever. It's the love language thing that everyone's been talking about, which is nonsense. But anyway, it's this idea of this is how it's shown and this is how it should be shown, rather than it being like this kind of formalized thing. It's sort of informal pressure or whatever that women sort of feel upon themselves, but it's like societal pressure or whatever at the same time as well. Like, it's really quite hard to break down in some ways, because you almost step into these roles willingly, or sort of like without knowing what you've done, or sort of like really what the motivation or whatever is behind it, and you do it because you do love the other person, and that's what's the most upsetting thing about all of this as well.
Yeah, because it's them exploiting you.
Yes.
But it's not coming from a place of, you know...
Yeah, it's not an individual thing. It's a reflection
not an
of broader...
act to say, well, I want you to do all this. It's not like kind of a degrading, kind of malevolent place. It's just that you take up these roles, whether you mean to, and you see it happen. Not just, you know, with people within their families, but in group settings where there might be one or two women, in a group setting with a lot of men, and then the women almost become the mammies of the group, you know, or they have to like shoulder this emotional kind of care, you know, this burden of care for people. It's like, well, you know, you can talk to the women about it, and it's like, well, why is it all put onto us? You know, so you see it kind of extend outside the family as well, but obviously within the family, it's really, really obvious.
But I think part of it at the same time as well does come down to the fact that, like, from an early age, you were trained not to respect your own free time.
Yeah.
Men don't have the same problem with setting up, like, no, I want to do this and this is important and my me time or whatever the case is important, because they, again, it's constantly reinforced throughout kind of like, be it media in whatever case and social norms and stuff like that, to have a man kind of come home and like, I've had a really hard day at work, I'm super stressed out, I'm going to like chill here and enjoy myself, watch TV or I don't know, whatever the case may be, and then to have like the woman come back in the same situation and be like, right, I suppose I'll put on dinner soon, will I?
So really, I suppose an important point would be that if we're talking about feminist movements and kind of sites of struggle, the real sites of struggle are going to have to take place within the area of social reproduction. You know, like what goes on outside of the workplace. You know, like this is specifically to feminist movements, like your class movement and your class struggle, of course, you know, that's kind of rooted in labour and stuff like that. But when you're talking about specifically the gender aspect or feminist movements, then you have to start looking at these areas, you know, having access to healthcare, having access to housing, and even the movements that you see, like the likes of water privatisation and stuff like that, they're heavily, you know, influenced, or they have huge amounts of women active in them, because at the end of the day, when things get difficult, it's generally women, and particularly the likes of maybe families that are with single mothers and stuff like that, you know, they're the ones that suffer first when there are cuts within the social services or things that are available.
Oh, so, yeah, but you saw it massively with the Right to Water campaign. Like if you were looking to get in and organise an estate, you spoke to the women of the estate, because they were the ones who knew everybody. They're like, this is social reproductive care that's happening, I suppose, across the community or whatever the case is. You would make sure that the women across the road, or the, you know, old couple across the road were like having milk, and like on a frosty day that someone had gone down to the shops to make sure that they'd got that for them, or even just tipping in to ask them how they're doing, kind of stuff. Yeah. And that way there is that sort of like network or whatever pre-existed. So they were able to sort of make use of that. But when you're talking about sites of struggle, like that's something that like affected each, say, family on that estate, because it was another cut out of what they were going to be able to take home. Like, you know, you've got your bills to pay and all the rest of it. So this is like, so the site of struggle in this case was the family or the home or whatever, and they were able to like organise on a community level, and then obviously build out, and was really successful in a multitude of different ways. But like, the idea of being able to challenge any of the other aspects. Once you have, say, economic liberation, and you have a bunch of women out, and they've succeeded in all the different ways in the workforce, and, you know, fuck it, the workers own the means of production now, and it's deadly, right? By no means does that follow them home in any way, shape or form. And it's not possible, because you need to have not just like your, it's going to sound really dodgy when I say it, but you need to have your, you know, cultural and social revolution at the same time as well as the economic one. And that's something that, like, I think women involved in the left, and it's much the same with like any, you know, minority group within a Marxist or communist understanding, knows themselves. Racism won't disappear overnight, like just
because of socialism. These are really kind of reductionist arguments that, well, actually we know that socialism will bring equality because of this, and it's like, well, no, that's not really, like, that's a real utopian, idealistic way of looking at it. It's like, no, these things have to be actively dismantled, like, within
none of these
culture.
Forms of liberation can happen under a capitalist system. But once you've destroyed that system and replaced it with something that is ours as workers, doesn't automatically dismantle everything else with it.
Because we aren't just workers.
Yeah, no, that's the thing, we're not. And like, when you're talking about actual intersectionality, like, that's what you're talking about, the different experiences that people have, the different forms of discrimination that they face, and the fact that all of these, or a lot of them, are going to be influenced by the culture and society we exist within. So the only way you can do that is by, in some ways, like dismantling what the home, the family, or the construct, or what, as to how that's understood.
Bell Hooks refers to it as the imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy.
See, Bell Hooks going to say it better than me.
So, like, that's really it. I mean, it can't take place in isolation. Like, you can't win rights in, you know, the developed or global north and stuff like that. That does not change the material conditions for people everywhere, you know. So it's all well and good saying we can have socialism or we can have, you know, more equal rights for women here when there's exploitation happening somewhere else. So I think, you know, for feminist movements, we probably, they need to return to the kind of more revolutionary aspects that were there previously, you know,
but they've existed in a multitude of iterations.
Yeah,
but they're not.
They've been pushed out of the so pushed out of the mainstream now that you know, we're kind of left that it almost seems too revolutionary to be talking about, you know, destroying capitalism.
Yeah, but like even sort of like the knock-on effects or whatever of that at the same time as well, like, destroy capitalism and then we have to take on the social and cultural change or whatever, and that stuff happens slowly, and that only can be done through like even kind of like breaking down the support systems or whatever that exist. Like, obviously I'm going to have like a really limited understanding or whatever of this because I can only speak from my experience on it, but like one of the big issues is going to be like the home and family life and things like that.
Yeah.
So the idea of even being able to take a huge amount of that work that has been kind of like, you know, reduced down to being the nuclear family's responsibility, to being something that can be broadened out. Like, people talk about the fact that children are raised by, it takes a village to raise a child, and you're kind of going, yeah, that sounds like a really good idea. Why are we putting it all on her?
Yeah.
You know, and actually kind of like questioning that. And like, I know this might sound like I'm trying to be, like I'm being idealistic or whatever the case is, but the concept of like even having the likes of workers' canteens or even having the likes of workers' laundries where they're doing what is typically now understood to be like domestic labour, taking it and placing it on a much broader scale, and having workers who are like adequately compensated for doing this or whatever at the same time as well, as opposed to it being all reduced down onto one person. Like, I don't know.
Even if you look at childcare, and when you think about the exorbitant cost of childcare just within Ireland,
but those they're very low earners.
So you either have to have it, you know, because you're so low waged or on minimum wage that you might get a subsidy, and that's fine. But, you know, if you're just above that and then you can't, so then you're paying out these huge amount of fees to go to work, to sell your labour, but like you're the only one that cost is put on. So you're like totally exploited here. You know, your employer is making money off the fact that, you know, they're paying you really low wages, they're making all the profits, and you're paying out huge amounts to have your child looked after so that you can go to a job that you barely make enough money to pay for your child to be looked after.
Like a chain of exploitation or whatever the case is as well, because you were going out to work, you need to cover your childcare, you're working, producing whatever it is that you're doing, whatever labour it is that you're engaging in, you're producing profits or whatever for this, and you're taking your tiny little bit of a cut of the value they've deemed your labour to be on that particular
But you're
day.
a woman and you want the right to go to work, and you've won that right.
But then you are taking that money and you're handing it across to another company or whatever the case is that has exactly the same chain of exploitation working out, where you've got someone coming in to mind other people's children to allow them to go to work.
And they're really low paid.
And this company or whatever that has organised centred around childcare is making a wonderful little profit on that, because we've all of these workers who are paying extortionate fees, and the workers who are actually working those jobs are earning very little at the same time. And then it's kind of a case of like, okay, and what happens to their kids? Where are their kids going? Grandparents. You know what I mean? Like it's completely ridiculous. Like.
the ability that capitalists had to push back all the costs, like so many of the costs, with actually having people within work producing things, that they have pushed that back mostly into a private household. Like, it's not even you're not getting state support for the majority of the things that you have to pay out. So it's unbelievable that, people are, not that they accept it as such, but
it has been normalised, though. It's not a case of being accepted. It is just kind of like how things are done. And we're not okay with it, but it is just sort of
what can we do?
Yeah, what can we do? We're all just caught up in it, and we have no real way of challenging that or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's even before COVID, the idea that if you took all of the childcare workers and they all got organised, they all got unionised, and there was one day, we'll say like a Tuesday, because I think like Mondays and Fridays are the worst days for people not showing up. So we'll have most workers expecting the vast majority of their workforce will be in on a Tuesday. We'll just stay home. We'll just go on strike and stay home and then see what happens. You'd be able to take out a lot of industries knocking around the place, because you'd have so many people calling and going like,
I have nobody to mind my child.
I have nowhere to put the trials. Can you explain to me what I'm supposed to do?
But then that would be the female worker that would stay home. If you like family, if like a man and woman, if they can't, if there's no childcare, like the woman would be the one staying home and the guy would go to work.
But the idea is that you would force an acknowledgement. Yeah. Well, first off, for the value of the work that childcare workers do, but an acknowledgement of what it is that essentially holds everything together. Yeah. Because ultimately, if you were to, the whole concept of a women's strike is essentially an impossibility, because people die if women aren't providing this labour for free. And this is the wonderful thing that you're able to do with nurses as well, predominantly female workforce. You want to go out on strike? That's cool. All these debts going to be on your head as a group, because you obviously don't care enough to show up. So we can use this emotional manipulation or whatever it is against you at the same time, while also not actually paying you anymore. Yeah. And then, guilt tripping you about the fact that you are looking for more money. Yeah. And being able to use this or whatever against you. And women have gone out and fought for the right to work and fought for, equal wages. We haven't quite got that. Mm-hmm. No. People who disagree that the wage gap is still a thing, but we're not getting into that argument. But the reason we've done it is to allow us to be, or the argument or whatever behind it was that you would have an independent source of income, that you could be in control of your own life, that you would be liberated in some way, which essentially is a lie. Yeah. Because you're so low paid, you're still probably economically dependent anyway. Exactly. And so all it really did was, I hate to use the terms race to the bottom, but I mean, it did just create another kind of antagonism. It's like, here's these women workers who will actually lower the cost of labour because we just got them all in there. Yeah. We just like doubled the reserve army of labour overnight by bringing women into the workforce. Because it was never something that was like, oh, this is fantastic. We've got a whole lot more people. We can work on a bunch of different projects or whatever. We were talking about a managed economy in some way. This is brilliant. This is more possible things that we can be doing now because we have more people. Instead, under a capitalist system, it's like, excellent. We've doubled our workforce overnight. They are now more scared, because we can tell them that we can replace them, which is exactly the way... And pay them less. Exactly, yeah. Which is the way that the constant kind of threat or whatever, that there is someone who is more hard up than you and will come and take this job from underneath you. And it's great that we kind of allow people to exist in this sort of way in life, where you don't have a job, you're desperate. You will take things, you will. And... I suppose we should probably discuss a bit how the pandemic has impacted the lives of women, particularly in the last year. Well, that's a bit like the childcare workers all decided to take off. But it's a little bit like that. Without any of the benefits of what that possibly could have done in regards to people's realisations of how things held together.
Yeah. But anyway. So, I mean, obviously, there was massive changes. If you even just take Ireland, the lockdowns, what are we in, the third lockdown now? Yes. Okay, third lockdown, I've lost count. So, I mean, there's people who were laid off, there's people who never returned to work, then there's people who've been working from home, but then the schools closed, childcare was closed. So, the difficulty I mean, we've all probably read articles in the mainstream media and different areas that said, you know, the increase in the workload of women, domestic workload particularly, has massively increased, like the demands on women, because they're trying to work from home, but they're also, because they're in their home and they're, you know, if they have children, the children are there, so they're homeschooling, they're doing a lot more of the domestic duties, because men often just revert into this role that, well, you're here, so you will do the domestic work. I mean, and I don't mean that in a bad way to put people down, but I mean, it's just ways that people interact. And, you know, it happened in my own family, you know. I'm the one that goes out to work. I was working full time in Dublin, and I'd go home, and I did not do the majority of the domestic work or child raising in my house. But since the pandemic, since I've been working from home, that's changed massively. So I still have to do my full-time job. I still have to do all the homeschooling, and I have to do a lot more of the domestic work. And I'm not trying to put my fella down.
Yeah.
You know, he's a good guy, but like that was just a role that I fell into and that he fell into. And I know in my mind that it's wrong. But
well, like I've already explained my case in regards to this with I very much seem to work the reverse, because in a relationship with a woman and she's already taken these trappings upon herself, I barely cook at all anymore. And it is disturbing how comfortable and how quickly I became comfortable or whatever with that setup, because you sort of know your laundry is going to be done if you just sort of leave it there. No,
I'm sure that's very comfortable.
Why wouldn't you? If there is somebody who's going to pick stuff up. It's mind-blowing to actually sit down and have this conversation with someone kind of going like, I would not be okay if this was in the reverse.
yeah.
And I have been in relationships where I've played the traditional female role. These are more often relationships with men, but like, and you sort of slot yourself into that, and then being on the other side of that and like not confronting what that is and what that has done to another person, because again, it's that complete and utter devaluation of free time, where I've got friends who are celebrating the fact that they can like throw on a wash or like get the laundry hung out on a break instead of like taking a break during their break time, because
you don't have to do it on your weekend. You can slot it in during your 8-hour workday at home, which you're still doing the work. It's still your time.
What happens instead, though, is you find other jobs to essentially do at the weekend, because you've nowhere to go. And it's like grand. Maybe it's a fun activity to be at for some people, but more often than not, it's a case of if you have the time, you will fill it with work. And now it's just a case of...
I think over the years there's been kind of attempts to place an actual monetary value on domestic work and stuff like that. I mean, it's not been something that's kind of gotten any traction really over the years. And you know, if you think about kind of how we normally engage with labour and stuff like that, you're talking about trade unions, but how can you, like, you can't extend the role of trade unions into, domestic work. Like, how do you do that? I know SIPTU did actually organise domestic workers, but they were employees of other families. But we're talking about the work that people do themselves within their own time to reproduce life, to keep going to work.
Because the argument, I think, an awful lot of the time is that people can combat it on an individual or like, nuclear family setup or whatever. And, it's like, oh, well, my fella totally does his fair play of stuff or whatever the case is. And like, we're a really sort of progressive household and all this kind of thing. And then, it's like, okay, that's great. I'm glad that you've got a boyfriend or a partner or whatever the case is who is like really supportive, which is like a ridiculous phrasing to use when it's like doing a fair share of the work that you both create in the house out of like existing and needing clean clothes or whatever the case is. But like, and this being a problem in and of itself, but anyway, that you can actually kind of like tackle that on an individual basis, and it's sort of again creates this implication that women who aren't in relationships like that are somehow at fault. It's like, well, why didn't you just pick a better man or whatever the case is? Like you can place like an emphasis or whatever on education for men in that setting. But again, how possible is any of this under a capitalist system? If you're
No, because
at
the end of the day,
it's not clean and hire a cleaner.
Capitalism itself could never actually function, if any value was placed onto that work. It just, that's it. It needs the same as like natural resources. It has to be able to freely exploit natural resources. Has to be able to freely exploit social reproduction, because the cost to the actual system would just. Well, we talk about crises in capitalism, but there would be no profit if it actually had to pay for all the work that gets done to keep capitalism going. It's like, as opposed to just low wages, you're talking about other areas.
Yeah, but this comes back to the same thing with even the likes of the nurses. The nurses like threaten to go on strike, and it's a case of like, here's the outcome of you going on strike and withdrawing your labour, and we're not going to give you what you ask for, but we're also going to hate on you for the fact that you've withdrawn this and talk about what terrible people you are. Very much the same sort of thing as a case of like, what, you're talking about you're not going to do your kids' laundry? Like, why do you hate your children so much?
You're a terrible mother.
Yeah, it's why did you even have kids? But someone should take them off you, give them to a nice mother who will be the ultimate sacrificial figure that we're all supposed to be as mothers or whatever the case is. But you know what I mean? Like
And on the other hand, like men that would do like a third of that, not even like being praised. I like that. What drove me mad during the first lockdown, it was all those articles like men are doing more housework now than they ever done before, and you're like, yeah, but all the women are doing 3 times as much as they have been doing before. But like, congratulations to you.
So it's kind of a reversal, and I suppose the call out that was going where it was like, what's it? Not all men, but enough. And it's like, not all men, never enough. I'm talking about housework. It just doesn't seem to add up in any way.
And I suppose another much more troubling element of women's experience in lockdown and the pandemic has been the massive increase in gender-based violence and domestic violence during 2020 or so far this year. But Safe Ireland, according to Safe Ireland, between September and December 2020, 2,018 women per month, on average, sought supports from domestic violence services, and there were an average of about 167 women per day in women's refuges, and there were still on average a further 7 people who couldn't be accommodated each day within these services. So, you're talking about people in lockdown, they're maybe at home much more with their abuser, and how there's not even any services, because it's not important to capitalism whether there is or isn't violence, within the society. That there is no cost to capitalism for that violence. So there's no money then for the services that are required to support people that actually find themselves in that situation.
It kind of shows just how disturbing things kind of really are, I suppose, when you break it down like that. The idea that you have 2 people in a house for extended periods of time, and one of them predominantly the man's answer to their social woes or whatever the case is, to act out in that way against another. It's I suppose it kind of highlights just how hidden an awful lot of this stuff is when people are able to like go out to work. Be it one or both people in the household or whatever who are leaving the house. So the idea that there are extended periods of time where you can be deemed to be safe, and that you would be returning back home and it not being that safe place.
But it's terrifying when you think about the amount of research that's out there that highlights the fact that economic recessions are positively correlated with gender-based violence, increases in domestic violence and gender-based violence. So we know that there are regular crises within capitalism, and yet, so we're aware that there is a looming recession. How can there not be after the the last 15 months or so. It was already on the way as just a normal part of capitalism, but we do nothing to kind of take action to address or alleviate what is going to end up being quite, a massive increase likely in domestic violence. Because there was research that showed, I can't think of the name of the researchers now, but they looked at the period around the time of the recession, in 2008, and I think between 2008 and 2009 in the US, there was a 75% increase in reports of domestic violence during that economic recession. So like it's not a small amount. I mean, we know about other things that do it, like the likes of the World Cup and stuff like that, really bizarre things. But economic recessions are really linked to increases in gender-based violence. Yet there's nothing ever done, in terms of social protections or services offered should these things happen. And they're generally the first things to be cut when there's an economic recession. So the things that are really needed are gone first.
It's sort of, well, first off, they're the easiest ones to cut in the sense of like who's going to go out and actually do anything about this or whatever, because I do think there is a strong element of victim blaming, I think, comes into it. And I think an awful lot of women buy into it in a really sort of we had this kind of discussion earlier on about the whole concept of it being self-protective in some way, where you can, like, that you follow the rules, so therefore you must be safe. And this person over here is clearly must have done something wrong. Like she was a stupid woman for having gotten involved with this man or whatever the case is, which is completely ignoring like how abuse starts or how it's kind of like perpetrated within the household and within the family and stuff like that. And it is a deeply uncomfortable issue to talk about. And again, you have men very much in the same way as a self-protective thing, being like, well, not me, not all men. I don't do this. We know there's like apparently 5 violent dudes in the country who are going around married to all of these women or whatever the case is, who are engaging in all of this domestic abuse, because it's never someone they know. And even if it was someone they know, it's always a case
there's a way to rationalise
it.
But he's always been such a good this, that and the other, so I suppose that kind of brings us full circle on everything that, for
well, I think
us.
it's like, particularly with the likes of domestic violence and stuff like that as well, and that you have linked to economic recession, you have this absolute huge increase. Again, it's like the sporting events and stuff like that, and these spikes or whatever that are seen. And these are times of like deemed to be high stress or whatever, right? You have men inability to provide for their family home. This might not even be someone who's got a long track record or history or anything with this. I'm not saying these things happen spontaneously, but if your masculinity has never been challenged in any particular way, and you've always seen yourself in some ways being part of the top of the pecking order kind of thing, and to have that taken away from you and how that actually is sort of acted out, it's like gender-based violence is one that acknowledges that women are lesser in a much more extreme way, but is also a reflection of how women are viewed by society when it's not as explicit, if that makes any sense, which is why it's not necessarily given the level of attention that it should be, though you have huge numbers of women dying at the hands of their partners or former partners or people who potentially wanted to be their partner kind of thing. Like, and there isn't this sort of acknowledgement that like this is what happens when you devalue us to such a degree.
But that's it. You're already, all the work that you do in terms of social reproduction is subordinate to productive work. There's no value to it. So there's only value can be created when you work outside. That's also, your labour is cheaper there. And then that kind of is perpetuated at every level of society, no matter what you do. We used to talk about, second-class citizens or whatever, that type of thing, but it's much broader than that, really. I mean, it's at every level, this is taking place. So I suppose that's why the changes that would actually improve the material conditions for women could never be achieved under capitalism. So you can never dismantle patriarchy within capitalism.
No.
Would you agree? Yeah.
It's not possible. That
No.
being said, I think one of the best reforms we could implement at any point is like serious, like hardcore beatings for like dudes who engage in domestic violence. I'm sorry, I know that sounds a bit like I'm just like going like, okay, we're talking about patriarchal concepts of justice, so therefore might makes right, which is clearly what's happening here. So fuck it, if this is what you're embracing, I argue we embrace the same thing and just make sure we outnumber them. And we do. I mean, we're 51% of the population. We can totally handle this. It'll be all right. Just get some really big women on our side. It'll be fine.
Yeah. So I suppose, like we've ragged on liberal feminism quite a lot tonight.
Quite a lot.
But having said that, I mean, it has and it continues to be exposed as being quite a hollowed out, bankrupt system, you know, as such. And there's a lot more positive, you know, movements that are showing signs of actually saying, no, this isn't what we want or whatever. You know, in 2018, I think it was, the Huelga Feministas in Spain had 5 million people out on the streets, and they said that they were withdrawing all their productive and reproductive work, which, you know, is showing that people are actually starting to broaden their concept of where their sites of struggle will be or different things like that. So, I mean, there is some positive, something positive to be, you know, considered here, that people are starting to look beyond just the workplace or legislative reforms or stuff like that into the whole questioning of society and how it is kind of how society and capitalism is actually a force for oppression. Well, I suppose we'll just finish up by thanking the New Theatre for the wonderful space here this evening, and the James Connolly Festival organisers for allowing us to do this event.
And also the wonderful comrades.
And comrades. It's been excellent. Okay, Slán.